So it's in a lot of the standards bodies. Of course, chairs some of the standards bodies there, and I'll let him do some more introduction of himself and his background. Thanks, Ed. Take it away.
Well, I know you all will be terribly distraught. This is my only slide, and I didn't even make it, so sorry about that. Yeah. So naturally, when Mike wanted somebody to talk about what not to do, he thought of me. I think that's a good thing. Not sure yet, but so I'll let you read for yourselves. I'm assuming we're all literate in English here, so it says all of these good and wonderful things. But what I wanted to talk about, I'm going to assume that you're all not already asleep. What I wanted to talk about is basically 4 major themes that I've seen that go to what kinds of things we've learned, what kinds of mistakes that I've seen. And I'll go ahead and give all 4 to you now, and you can figure out whether you want to stick around for the rest of it. So the first one is a meter is not a computer. Another one is that utility benefits aren't necessarily utility customer benefits. A third, you probably have heard before, encryption is not security. And then the last one, maybe you hear a little less often, is trust is not a binary value. So because I'm talking about what not to do, I'm using all kinds of negative words there, things that are not. So let's start with the first one, which is that a meter is not a computer. Now, that is probably painfully obvious to everyone here, but here's how such a thing gets started and why it can be misleading. When I'm trying to explain to someone who doesn't know anything about microprocessors or computers or the grid or anything like that, what a meter actually does. It measures stuff. That's very basic. And the way it used to measure stuff is a lot of little spindly gears that turn around. It's sort of like a grandfather clock. But the way it currently does it, it's all electronic. And so it's got a little microprocessor in there. So at that point, people sometimes say, oh, sort of like a little computer. And I say, yes. Well, right, I take that back. I used to say yes. Now I say, well, not exactly. So the difference between, of course, a meter and a computer is that a computer, so let's pick a typical kind of computer. So the laptop I happen to have has a dual-core processor running at 2.2 gigahertz, where a meter might have maybe a 32-bit single-core, maybe a single-core 16-bit microprocessor running at maybe 20 megahertz. So, okay, so we got right there, it's 2 orders of magnitude difference. So 100 times faster, and then maybe 200 times if you count 2 cores. Maybe 4 times if you have 16 versus 32-bit, but at least 2 orders of magnitude difference. Now, if you think about the RAM, the memory in my laptop happens to be about 1 gigabyte of memory. And with a typical meter, which is an embedded device, that has maybe on the order of 1 meg. So the difference there, now we're up to like 3 orders of magnitude difference. And then my laptop happens to have a 500 gigabyte hard drive. So its non-volatile storage that it has available to it is about that. And even on the metering devices that have a lot of memory, so things like not the ones that are on the side of a house, but on the side of maybe a small business, commercial and industrial stuff, may have maybe 5 megabytes. So that, now we're up to like 5 orders of magnitude, 10,000 times more. So the reason that's important is that the meter doesn't have the same resources available. And among the resources, one of them that was just mentioned recently was connectivity. So when that UPS truck parks in front of the meter that's trying to communicate with the other ones around it via RF, it might have a hard time transmitting through that metal side of that van. So unlike, say, Amazon.com's corporate servers, it won't necessarily be connected all the time. Now it'll have, most often it'll be connected, but it won't be all the time. The other things that may not be quite as obvious about what the difference is between a meter and a computer is an environmental difference. So one of the questions is, okay, so if I buy a laptop, does it work at 85 degrees C? Does it work down to minus 40? No, it probably won't even start. What about humidity? Well, probably not. Now, the other thing that's different about this laptop stuff versus meter is that these days they all have fans and there are vents in the side. Well, you can't do that with a meter for the reason that it needs to be, at least in North America, it's almost always mounted outside. So it has to be weather tight. It also has to be impervious to insects, right? So for whatever reason, insects tend to like electricity. And so they come in and enough of them get in there and it doesn't work anymore. So that's a problem. So those are two differences. The third difference is power consumption. Now, the original, I don't know how many of you have been around for that long or paid attention, but the original Pentium, when it came out, actually consumed 60 watts, just the processor. Now, by regulation, there are standards, I'm going to say this is one of the very few occasions where both the IEC and the ANSI standard actually agree on the exact same number, and they both agree that these devices shall have a power budget of no more than 5 watts. So that's 1/12 of what the original Pentium alone, that's not including peripherals, and the thing that really eats up the juice on these things is the backlight, the display, right? So you've got 5 watts, but you can't even use all of that for the reason that if you think about how a meter is actually constructed, you've got this little plastic module with electronics in it, and then you take that and you connect it up to the base, the socket. And then, oh, by the way, now you also have this nice, neat little plastic cover that fits over. So you've got this active electronics inside of what's essentially a thermos bottle, and then you put it outside, so it's got this heat load of the sun. And by the way, these devices have to work in the summer, they have to work in the winter, they have to work in Alaska, they have to work in the San Joaquin Valley when it's 109 out. So that 5 watts is great if you can use all of that without blowing your thermal budget in the first place. So those are some very fundamental differences. The other one that I'll mention briefly, but is going to be a recurring theme, you're going to get sick of it, is cost. Typical meter on the side of your house costs a lot less than even a cheap laptop. So that could change, and certainly my employer would be really interested in selling more expensive stuff because we get more margin on that. And there's a problem with that, which is that it's unlikely that that's going to be palatable for, people like me who also happen to pay our electricity bills every month. I'm not going to want to buy things that are 5 times more expensive just because they're 5 times more expensive. I want to make sure that the money that's spent on all this smart grid stuff is spent rationally, spent wisely, that actually gets some benefit back. And so that brings us to the other point that was also mentioned earlier, but it bears repeating, and that is the fifth aspect that makes a computer different from a meter is longevity. Anybody here, well, let me ask the easy question first. So who here does not have a cell phone? Okay, nobody doesn't have a cell phone. Okay, so that's kind of what I thought. All right, now who here has a cell phone that's more than 2 years old? We got about 4.
Owned or actively used? Because I own a bunch.
Oh yeah, well, sir, I got a Motorola bag phone, but I don't use it, so that doesn't count.
You can't use it, it's analog.
Well, I could use it. I could just only talk to other people who had, you know,
Analog iPhone.
who were like, yeah, if there's somebody who's a collector of a base station, for example. That's an expensive hobby, I imagine. So, yeah, so the point being that you have this expectation that the device you buy is going to be replaced in 2 years. And as we've already heard, the expectation for the longevity of a metering device is 15 or more years. So if you think about that, so 15 years ago would be 1996, if my math is right. Better check that. I didn't run it through a simulator, but I think that's correct. So 96, think about what you had computationally in 96. All right? Okay, so now I know exactly what I had. I actually happened to be working for, I was doing BIOS development at that time. And so I had the latest, greatest, fanciest machine from a big supplier. And it was a 486 DX2 100, or maybe might have been a DX4 100, but anyway. So it was the bee's knees, all sorts of grand stuff. I probably had something outrageous like maybe 128 mega RAM, huge amounts, right? Maybe, I don't know how big the hard drive was, but those are all kind of laughable specs these days. My cell phone has more hard drive storage than, you know, than that entire machine did, probably than the whole department had at the time. I think we were doing BIOS development, right? So if you think about that, what that means is that there are certain design decisions that you can make now that actually will affect what it is you do in the future. So as one particular example, I've talked with a number of folks about things like hardware security modules. Now, one advantage to a hardware security module is that you have all kinds of useful pieces on the module itself. So it has a capability typically, and I'm going to speak in generalities, but it would have a capability of storing cryptographically sensitive material in a secure manner. It's designed so that it's, or often, again, generalizing here, they're often designed so that even if you have, even if you can decap them and you start probing around the layers, the layout of the device may be such that it makes it difficult for even somebody with a whole lot more tools than I have at my house or even in my lab to be able to go probe around. They make even that part difficult. And it has another advantage, which is that a lot of cryptographic algorithms that are in common use today can be made much, much faster in hardware than you can possibly do them in firmware. So those are the advantages, but one of the potential disadvantages are, okay, so what kind of a hardware security module might I have chosen in '96? And I don't have great answers. I just have a bunch of bad answers. Well, yeah, DES, that's right. So in '96, you know, AES is 5 years in the future, right?
Triple DES.
So, well, triple DES if you're really paranoid like you are, but for us ordinary plebeians, it'd probably be just single. So, but yeah, that's a really good point you need to think about is how long is the decision that you're going to make today going to need to last. You can download new firmware. It's really hard to download new transistors. So I'm told. Maybe that'll change in 15 years too. That'd be great. So that's why a meter is not a computer in a nutshell. So let's get on to the next bit, which is utility benefits are not necessarily customer benefits, utility customer benefits. Now this, here again, this is probably fairly obvious to anybody who's been in the industry for any amount of time. But one of the things that has been useful about deploying all these AMI systems, now you no longer have to send that poor hapless army of dog-bitten AMI readers with their trucks that are, by the way, using fuel and emitting carbon, right? Then you don't have to send those guys out every single month to go read meters by the millions. Instead, you just sit in your nice air-conditioned office and you get the data that comes back to you. And that's a huge advantage because now you don't need all of those guys.
My statement to that is you're going to replace the AMR truck readers with repair personnel to work on the AMI system. And you're going to pay them twice as much.
So so the comment is you might actually wind up replacing the AMI or the meter readers with repair people. Well, if so, then that would be sort of an excellent job stimulus thing, right? So that's another way of looking at that. Maybe. I think it probably would be that you wouldn't need quite as large an army, but it is also true those guys tend to cost a little bit more because they know things. So it still is and has been traditionally one of the benefits of deploying an AMI system is this great deal of labor saving that you get, and therefore cost saving. And that's a really, really attractive thing to your CFO of your utility. And in theory, that eventually gets reflected in what the ratepayers are actually paying for electricity. But it's not a thing that Joe homeowner's going to get really excited about, saying, oh boy, they're replacing my meter today, which means ultimately, next time the PUC meets, they might reduce my KWH rate for off-peak hours from 12 cents to 11 cents. I think I'm going to buy a bottle of champagne and celebrate that. That's just really hugely exciting for me. I think that it's probably fairly obvious to most of us at this point that a number of the things that were genuine benefits, they're real benefits of AMI, has already been deployed, are benefits to the utility, but not enough of those have been translated successfully into benefits for Joe homeowner, who doesn't really sit around all day looking at his, even the ancient watt-hour meters that have the spinning elements in there. I don't just sit out, even I don't sit out there and watch the thing, right? And I also probably don't want to sit at home all day and monitor, okay, now power is really expensive right now, so I think I will make a command decision and not do the dishes. Now I will wait until power is cheaper. And it's not just because I'm lazy, by the way. So I have a rationalization there. But those kinds of actual benefits. So benefits that we might be able to actually provide for our customers. I know some of the utilities are actually doing this successfully. Is things like you can reduce your cost. I mean, that's a really fundamental thing that very few people will say, not interested. That's pretty universally interesting to pretty much universally all of your customers. And to the degree that AMI system can be deployed to meet that kind of a need, then that is of interest to your customers. And therefore, one of the things that is an advantage to you is perhaps you'll get less opposition to deploying an AMI system if a Joe homeowner can see a real benefit. I think we all know the whole long and boring story, so I won't recount all of it here, but one of the things that happened in California was there was a rate increase that happened about the same time that PGE did a massive rollout. And that was kind of painful for them because the associated rate increase is something that the homeowners actually see when they open up the bill. They say, oh, my power bill went up and I got a new meter. So the next thing is, therefore, and then we lead to a conclusion that may or may not have rationality behind it, but that's I think a really important part of understanding how to do this AMI stuff well, is to figure out what the benefit is to your customers and making sure that's well communicated. So third point, this is going to be old hat to almost all of you, I'm sure, but I'll describe it anyway, which is encryption is not security. So this is, if you'll open your prayer books to chapter, right? So you've heard this one before, I'm sure. But the key point, if you pardon the expression, is that the encryption bit is not hard. It's really the key management part is the more difficult problem. And now, if we think back to the earlier point where I said a meter is not a computer, this leads to some interesting things in that, well, we already know how to manage certificates, for example. The World Wide Web uses certificates. When I go purchase something from Amazon.com, or in my case, more likely, carparts.com. But when you get one of those commercial websites, then it's an HTTPS, and what happens is they have a certificate that's associated with them, and there's some interesting things that happen in the background. And one of the interesting things that happens in the background is that certificate that I receive, first off, is uniquely identified with whoever it is that I'm hoping to be doing business with. So there's a way that my browser, if I'm doing a purchase via the web, it actually can validate that that certificate is a real one. So it hasn't expired, it's really associated with who it's supposed to be, and it's issued by, well, that's a question. So who's it issued by? It's issued by some entity that my browser already knows about. So if you download the latest version of Firefox, for example, one of the browsers, it comes out of the box with about 150 different certificates. So now you can add to those, but if you think about, okay, so 150 certificates, and then what happens, the way they're used is that I find out that Amazon.com really is Amazon.com and not, a bored college student in Romania who's decided he's going to go fishing for the day. It's a one-way authentication as typically used in the moment. So I can tell it's Amazon. Amazon doesn't really care if it's me. If I type in a valid credit card number, and there again, we had a sidebar conversations about whether that's a good model, but that aside, that's how it works today. And the effect is that, so I've got 150 odd certificates. I can verify another certificate, and all I can really do is say that guy is who he is, but I haven't done the verification in the other direction. So if we were to transplant that verbatim into the context of, say, something like smart thermostat wants to validate that the data it's getting, it claims, some distant entity claims that power is very expensive right now. And what I want to do is I want to minimize my power bill. So I'm going to say if power is cheap, I want it to be 68 degrees. If power's a little bit more expensive, if it's summertime, I'll say let it go up to 72 degrees. If power is really expensive, I'm willing to let it get all the way up to like 76 degrees, and I want the ability to override and all this good stuff. Let's say you had all that in place. Okay, so in order to, now I've delegated that decision-making to the thermostat. I've explained what my preferences are, and I don't want to sit there and monitor all this junk all the time, so I'm going to say, and I'm, by the way, going to define what expensive means, right? It kind of depends on my preferences, my income, my expectations. So I put all that into my smart thermostat, and it gets data from the distant end. It says, by the way, power is really expensive right now. It may be that the meter says, or the smart thermostat says, well, who says? Is this really Power Company Inc., or is it the little 16-year-old hacker next door who likes to send out joke emails and interesting things? So you might say, well, one way to do that would be to provide a certificate. And then you get into why an AMI system really isn't a computer network. And that is that, okay, so first, so now we're saying if we follow a model exactly, then this lowly thermostat that might have, I don't know, I'm one of those guys that takes things apart. I suspect there are a number of you in the audience. But my particular thermostat happens to have an 8-bit micro in it. And it's a common core. It's been around for a long time. It's based on 8051. And it is going to have a hard time actually verifying even a signal signature. And then if I've got a chain of signatures that this poor thing has to verify, that's kind of a lot to do. Now, it could be done, but it's not done with the same cost, relatively speaking, as it is done on the internet. So those differences are not necessarily insurmountable, but they can't be discounted. You must pay attention to that there is a difference. And then obviously if vendor A says, oh, well, I've got a key that's 128 bits long. Vendor B says, well, I've got one that's 3,000 bits long. Then obviously the question would be, okay, so first off, what encryption algorithm? What are you encrypting? How are you managing the keys? How are you storing the keys? There are a whole host of questions that are a lot more expensive to get wrong than which key size you've used. So if you're using AES 128, that's probably going to be fine for many, many years to come, as long as you can keep the keys secret. So how do you keep the keys secret? That is the question you should be asking. And then the last bit I'm going to talk about is trust is not a binary value. So to take if you don't already believe that, then here's a really simple test. So let's say you trust the neighbor's kid to feed your dog while you're gone. Do you also trust the neighbor's kid to do liver transplant surgery on you? Now, could be the kid's a prodigy, but I'm gonna go way out on a limb and take a guess that the answer is probably no to the latter. That might be a little much for the lad. Smart as he is, maybe in a few years, but not today, not at least until he graduates high school.